On February the 28th, 1986, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated by lone gunmen on the streets of Stockholm. Just before his assassination, Palme was in the process of cracking down on Swedish arms dealers who were funneling guns to the Nicaraguan Contras and to the Iranian regime. Shades of Ollie North. The Iran-Contra scandal had not yet broken publicly, and Palme's probe threatened to blow the lid on the entire covert program of the Israeli Mossad, B'nai B'rith, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, the Anti-Defamation League, and, of course, the American Intelligence Network. Curiously, many of the guns being sold by the Swedes with the collusion of Oliver North, the CIA Chief William Casey, and the Israelis were coming from East Germany and other Soviet bloc states. Are you beginning to understand the implications? Was Palme in the process of unearthing a cynical East-West collusion, as I have warned you about previously? An even nastier reality buried beneath the then unknown Iran-Gate scandal? Was he about to blow the lid on the phony Cold War? Had he inadvertently stumbled onto the trail of the Anti-Defamation League's own involvement in this demi-monde of gun and drug dealing? Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely. The answer to that question was implicitly given within days of the Palme assassination, when the Anti-Defamation League joined with the KGB and the East German Stasi, State Security Service, in an effort to blame the Palme murder on Swedish associates of Lyndon LaRouche, who had already exposed all of their dirty dealing. ADL Fact-Finding Division Chief Erwin Sewell, himself an Oxford University-trained active member of the Socialist International, an alumni of our President William Clinton, personally flew to Stockholm to fuel the disinformation campaign linking LaRouche to the Palme murder. Soviet Ambassador Boris Pankin, a major general in the KGB who specialized in planting disinformation in the Western press, directed the Soviet side of the LaRouche-killed Palme hoax. While Georgei E. Arbatov, the head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, USA-Canada Institute, added his voice to those accusing LaRouche, ultimately the Soviet government-owned TV network aired an hour-long docudrama elaborating this lie. And it was a lie. The role of Edgar Bronfman's pals in the East German Stasi in the Palme cover-up would not surface until 3 years later. However, back in August of 1989, the Stockholm daily newspaper, Expression, revealed that Swedish police had bugged the home of a resident KGB agent and had audio tape evidence that the man knew at least 24 hours before Palme's murder that the Prime Minister would be killed. This alone absolved Lyndon LaRouche. The pivotal role of the Stasi in the Palme murder cover-up was first revealed in the August 20 through 26, 1992 edition of Journalisten, the magazine of the Swedish Journalists Association, which published an interview with a former top Stasi officer named Herbert Bremer. In that interview, ladies and gentlemen, and in a series of subsequent Swedish nationwide radio broadcasts, Bremer confessed that as an official of Department X, which is disinformation of the Stasi, he personally had engineered the disinformation campaign blaming the European Labour Party, ELP, the Scandinavian affiliations of Lyndon LaRouche for the Palme murder. Bremer told Journalisten, quote, "At my desk, I drew up the outlines of how the ELP theory would be conduit into the Swedish police investigation. The plan was to have a national Swedish newspaper receive an anonymous telephone tip-off. As an alternative, the information would go directly to one of the special tip-off phones made available by the police. The content would be along the lines that the caller, quote, knew that the ELP had committed the crime, end quote. In addition, he or she had, quote, witnessed hectic activity in the ELP headquarters in the night, end quote. Nothing was really true, but it sounded well-informed and credible, end quote. Indeed, the 1986 Stasi-manufactured disinformation was conduited into the United States media through the Anti-Defamation League. NBC television ran the story as a leading news item on their evening news broadcast, interviewing Anti-Defamation League official Sewell as part of their coverage, just as they conducted repeated interviews with Anti-Defamation League officials and officials of the Cult Awareness Network, another branch of the B'nai B'rith, during the Waco massacre. Ultimately, the United States Justice Department would use the Palme disinformation to justify a massive paramilitary police raid against LaRouche's home and offices of his associates in Leesburg, Virginia in October 1986, resulting in a tremendous miscarriage of justice. Am I a supporter of Lyndon LaRouche? Not on your life, ladies and gentlemen, for he himself is a closet socialist masquerading as a conservative. The LaRouche killed Palme hoax was no isolated instance of Edgar Bronfman and the ADL teaming up with a communist secret police agency to target a political enemy or ply a lucrative business scam. It is, and always has been, and will be unless you stop it, standard operating procedure for the Anti-Defamation League. According to syndicated columnists Rowland Evans and Robert Novak, on January 23, 1989, Bronfman hosted a secret meeting at his New York City penthouse to forge what the columnists dubbed, quote, a Jews for grain, end quote, deal between the Soviet Union and Israel. Also present at the gathering was Dwayne Andreas, the chairman of the Archer Daniels Midland ADM grain cartel and a long-standing ally and financial backer of the Anti-Defamation League. The Wall Street Journal had dubbed Andreas Gorbachev's closest pal in the West. At congressional hearings, Andreas identified former Anti-Defamation League National Chairman Ben Epstein as the man who taught him all he knew about politics. The Bronfman-Andreas deal was straightforward in return for vast quantities of dirt-cheap grain from ADM and other United States-based grain cartels. The Soviet government would permit the mass exodus of Soviet Jews to Israel. It was an updated version of the Pollard espionage affair, in which United States military secrets were swapped for controlled Soviet Jewish migration to Israel. The invariant in the two efforts was the central role of the ADL. Now, I'd like to ask all of you out there who claim that the Soviet Union is controlled by Jews, why are so many Jews immigrating from the Soviet Union? I know the answer, but I bet you don't. As part of the Bronfman-Andreas deal, the Soviet KGB teamed up with the ADL and Bronfman's World Jewish Congress, the WJC, to foment a diplomatic breach between the Reagan administration and Austrian President Kurt Waldheim, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. The KGB manufactured and the ADL WJC conduited phony evidence that the Waldheim had been a top Nazi war criminal during World War II. United States Attorney General Ed Meese, still employing the legal services of Anti-Defamation League fellow traveler, that's right folks, fellow traveler, Leonard Garment, bit on the forged material and declared Waldheim persona non grata in the United States. The purpose of the smear job was to shut down Austria as a way station for Soviet Jews coming out into the West. In the past, once Soviet Jews landed on Austrian soil, they were granted political refugee status, which then enabled them to settle in any country of their choosing. The majority either stayed in Western Europe or found their way to the United States. Very few went to Israel voluntarily. With Austria shut down, Bronfman and Gorbachev worked out alternative routes through Warsaw Pact states and eventually set up direct flights from the Soviet Union to Israel to ensure that the Soviet refugees had no choice as to where they would live. By the time Bronfman and Andreas forged their Jews for grain deal with Gorbachev in early 1989, the ADL had just about perfected their use of forged KGB documents to smear the entire Eastern European community in the United States as closet wartime Nazis. As early as 1979, the ADL had played a pivotal role in getting legislation through the United States Congress establishing the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, a special Nazi hunting unit inside the criminal division of the Justice Department directly against, ladies and gentlemen, all of our laws, our ethics, and our morals. This, in fact, was direct recognition of one specific religion against the Constitution of the United States of America, specifically to reap revenge upon their imagined enemies. ADL Asset Representative Elizabeth Holtzman had sponsored the bill, which effectively stripped naturalized American citizens of Central European and Ukrainian descent of their constitutional rights by providing for automatic denaturalization and deportation without any due process whatsoever, if the OSI could produce evidence that they had been tied to the Nazis during World War II. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court has ruled that no one can strip an American citizen of their citizenship. Period. For any reason. Yet they do it. And you sit out there and don't say a word. And where did the lion's share of this evidence come from? 40 years after the end of World War II? From the Soviet archives, ladies and gentlemen. And how were they getting information from the Soviet archives, a communist nation behind an iron curtain, supposedly our bitter enemies? The ADL-sponsored OSI provided Moscow with a foot in the door to the American judicial system. For the first time ever, Soviet documents and witnesses were given full standing in United States court proceedings, no questions asked. The enemies of the United States of America, bound by their vows and oaths of office to the Soviet Union, publicly declared their goal is to destroy the United States of America. While a handful of the people targeted by the ADL-OSI may have been low-level Nazi sympathizers or assets during the war, many innocent people fell victim to the KGB's sophisticated forgers, courtesy of the Anti-Defamation League and their friends at the Justice Department's OSI. And what was the purpose of this? To keep the Jews in line by continually whipping them with the threat of another Nazi Holocaust. That's what. To maintain their power. That's what. Remember the man who was sent to Israel and tried And found guilty and then tried again and found innocent?